Hello there, kia ora, and welcome to this week's Omnibus edition. Look, it has been another whirlwind week, and again, there's stuff I don't even get to cover, like David Seymour having a meltdown around Te Atatu being offered as part of courses at universities, or flies being found in kids' school lunches, or the frozen meals that have been brought over from Australia for kids' schools lunches. It's really weird. Simeon Brown, he got caught out a couple of times this week. One lying about the health budget, where he keeps saying, we've done 16 billion over 3 years, but that 16 billion is supposed to be over, I think it's 12 years or 9 years. It's a long time, and it's not a massive increase when you put it out the way that it is supposed to be spent. Or the fact that he changed the way that bowel cancer screening works, which means an extra 111 people are likely to die because of these changes that he's put in place. That's a horrifying number. And it ignores completely the fact that they say they want to deal with issues based on need. And this is a need because people in the Māori and Pacifica community tend to get symptoms of bowel cancer or tend to develop bowel cancer 10 to 15 years earlier than non-Māori and Pacifica people. And that's a genetic thing. So if you want to target based on need, yes, you need to target that particular area around ethnicity. But no, they don't want to do that. They're going to just lower the age by 2 years for everybody and get rid of that pre-screening for bowel cancer for those communities. So 111 people are more likely to die because it won't be picked up in time because that screening process is gone. How's that for getting New Zealand back on track? Anyway, as I said before, whirlwind of a week. So check out this week's Omnibus. Hello there, kia ora. A lot of people have been asking lately, what's wrong with Winston Peters after his latest US imported culture war ramblings against what he calls woke DEI measures by introducing a members' bill to repeal parts of the Public Services Act, an act he supported in 2000 when New Zealand first voted for it. At the time, their Tuaisi, their deputy, said it was a fantastic act that allowed the public service sector to remain agile in an ever-changing world. Now, of course, these current comments are a direct parroting of the crap that's coming out of the Trump administration, which leads to the removal of images of the Enola Gay, the plane that dropped the first atomic bomb, because it has the word gay in it, along with purging records of people who had gay as a surname. So it's clearly not a well thought out, actionable plan based on any kind of evidence. In fact, it's a really clear example of indoctrinated behavior from the crowd who scream about not indoctrinating children. And when he was laughed at for being the crazy old uncle people avoid at Christmas because of his rantings, Peters doubled down in describing woke as a tool for politically correct fascists who harass people about how they think. From the MP who yells at media about how they don't think the way he does, with a supporter base who yell at people who don't agree with them on things like the efficacy of vaccines because of science, and from an MP who wants to remove tools that teach children how to think critically. And apparently pearl clutchers who can't define what a woman is also included in the list, which is a common strawman argument used by the far right to try and create gotcha moments and prove that they live in a box of binary worldviews who don't actually care for people's free expression if that expression doesn't conform to their worldview. Now, I'm not going to sit here and point out the issues with the Deputy Prime Minister's latest sundown moment. There'll be a bunch of pearl clutching, vice signaling right wing knuckle draggers who do that inadvertently by claiming it's a genius level move, like everything else that they seem to agree with. But what is interesting here is the timing. Peters has a habit of pushing the talking points of his conspiracy dwelling voters at specific times. Two of the most common are when Peters is being overshadowed by David Seymour and when opinion polls show that New Zealand First is starting to flag. And both of those have happened recently. The past few weeks' news cycles have been dominated by Seymour. Sure, the Tim Jago thing sure didn't last long in the media, but Seymour's school lunch program has. It's constantly there at the moment, and it hasn't been helped by Seymour avoiding meetings with Erica Stanford and talking down to media about it, which means that Winston Peters has had less time in the spotlight, which leads to a dropping in his polling numbers. So, what does he do? He makes a bit of noise. His firing of Phil Goff last week and his comment about putting Luxon in power so he can unilaterally do what he wants got some headlines, which his core base responded to but didn't get prolonged coverage in mainstream media, which is what Peters needs to build up his voter base within his new core base. And there is a looming deadline for when he steps down as Deputy Prime Minister. And if he's not getting all the extreme headlines as Deputy Prime Minister now, imagine how much he'll be ignored when he's the third clown out of the car. And his voter base are not happy. New research from Horizon released this week show that of the three coalition parties, New Zealand First voters are the ones with the biggest regrets, with 36% of New Zealand First voters feeling disappointed in the outcomes, actions, and direction that the country is currently going, thanks to the government. You know, like this, the 53% rise in people sleeping rough over the past 4 months since the government instigated tougher restrictions on emergency housing and claimed that they've done an amazing job in reducing the need for that emergency housing. Half of the opinion polls out this year so far have had the party right on the threshold for getting back into Parliament, like this one from One News, which had them at just on the threshold. If voters move within the margin of error, they wouldn't be back in Parliament. And most people can see the party and its leader have done that to themselves. They moved their focus from their traditional voter base of older people who they can scare with horror stories of Maori getting equitable outcomes and Asians coming to buy all the houses, while they get ignored after their years of hard work for the country and deserve to get a gold card for free so they can get, free bus fares and maybe a discount at a local Domino's. Instead, they're focusing on a fringe group who voters think aren't particularly great. This is a group who thinks that Donald Trump should be president of New Zealand, vaccines cause autism, and DEI means mediocre white folks should get preferential employment opportunities over much more qualified people from marginalized groups because they believe reverse racism is a thing, but institutional racism isn't. And that original core voter base gets a tiny increase in pension, increased costs in medications, food, power, rates, rent, and other costs with no targeted help, which ironically many of them feel they should have, but it shouldn't be extended to other marginalised groups. It makes them seem out of touch with the average New Zealander and much less understanding of the actual needs of the population in an effort to pander to a specific small group of voters who already have an inbuilt distrust in the systems that put New Zealand first in power. But if it grabs attention from David Seymour and puts Winston in the headlines, no matter how much it's based on falsehoods or imported American cultural war talking points, the New Zealand First will keep it up, knowing it's going to appeal to at least some of their voter base. Hello there, kia ora. I'm really starting to think that Christopher Luxon's lack of political experience just might, be a bit of a hindrance in his job. Yesterday on the Tiles, he came out in general support of fighting woke DEI hires that was floated by Winston Peters in one of his imported culture war brain fades. He considered well-being woke, according to what he said to the press, and said he was putting their least woke MP onto fixing things, Judith Collins. Collins doesn't believe in woke and would never stoop to parading something like a person's heritage or connections to get a job. By the way, her husband is Samoan, so talofa. And she would never virtue signal in any way, by visiting a church to pray for a photo op before an election to appeal to Christian conservatives. During the Tile talk, the Prime Minister reiterated that he simply wanted to make sure that the government he ran was a meritocracy and that government workers were employed on merit. Now, that doesn't exactly not happen. I mean, the law that they're looking at changing, the one that New Zealand First voted in originally in support, basically is a broader understanding of representation for communities when it comes to hiring people, and it takes on board a wider range of experiences as part of the consideration. But that's woke. So instead, he wants to ask an MP who promoted the business her husband was a director of, the MP who leaked private information about a private citizen to right-wing blogger Cameron Slater, the MP who Winston Peters claimed approached him in 2014 with a deal to form a coalition with her as leader if they agreed to roll John Key, to the MP that he's asked to look at the wokeness on display and help reshape the public service sector into a meritocracy. And of course, his party, it leads by example. They're all there, totally based on merit, and nothing like nepotism or wokeness getting in the way for a government that's clearly speaking to New Zealanders right now from a Prime Minister that they clearly respect. But he needs to hand this over to Collins because he can't actually do it. You see, Christopher Luxon is too woke. After all, He was the one who gave safe seats to men during the general election, then said he really wanted to have half the caucus being women. And that's incredibly woke. And look, I get why he chose Collins. It's tough to pick who would be best to fill that role of making sure public servants aren't too woke, based purely on merit. I mean, you wouldn't want someone too woke, and totally pick someone based on merit is a little difficult sometimes. It must have been a really difficult choice, since clearly all the MPs are there based purely on being meritorious people, like the soon-to-be Deputy Prime Minister, who Snapchatted children, who's avoided answering questions about what he knew about convicted child abuser Tim Jago, the man behind the ongoing drama that's the new school Gloop program, who for some reason is the Associate Minister of Education. Or Andrew Bailey, who got drunk and abused a former defence worker at a winery before an animated discussion made him self-demote before running away to Mount Everest. He could have gone for Nepo baby Todd McClay. He can't be woke after all. He voted against marriage equality, safe abortion access, and stopping conversion therapy. And as Trade Minister, he was yelling racist insults in Parliament at MPs born overseas. So that's not woke. But he does have a habit of rabbiting Chinese government lines, and you don't get much more woke than communism. Maybe he could have gone with Sam Uffindale. He's clearly there on merit, because everyone looked at the report on his brutal attack with a bed leg as a student that Luxon clearly released. Or maybe Deputy Speaker Barbara Kuriger, who is clearly meritorious and has never used her position as an MP to try to get her family out of a shitstorm with MPI for animal abuse. But I guess she got her role already as Deputy Speaker, based purely on merit. Maybe he needs to look at some of his newer MPs, like Tom Rutherford, whose mother is the Bay of Plenty National Party event manager and mentored by National Party stalwart Tony Ryle on how to be an MP in a safe seat. Maybe Ryan Hamilton, who was linked to conspiracy theories about fluoridation and COVID, calling mandates illegal even after going to a resident and ratepayers sovereign citizen-aligned group meeting about 15-minute cities, where he sat in the audience while the conspiracy nutted issues arrest warrants to other councillors that were there, and then stood up at the end of the event after everyone had left and said, "Hey, I'm one of you." I mean, that's clearly not woke and sounds like the merits that we're seeing in the meritocracy Luxon's created. But he was a member of Destiny Church, and the Destiny Church do show up at more rainbow events than, Kid Amin, the winner of RuPaul's Drag Race. So that is pretty woke. Maybe someone like Greg Fleming. After all, he was campaigning against prostitution reform and civil union acts before he entered Parliament. But he also did some really woke stuff, like starting a charity working to help stem intergenerational poverty, and he gave his maiden speech in both Te Reo Māori and English. Maybe the former press secretary for Jenny Shipley and John Banks, Cameron Brewer, who called his victory in Upper Harbour a win for pale, stale males when he beat Labour's Venushi Walters. Maybe he could be considered there on merit. After all, he did once ban Rodney Hyde from wearing bright clothes in Newmarket when Hyde was the MP there. But he does use his social platforms to promote woke things like puppy adoption. If those puppies were adopted on merit and not how they looked, it might be a different matter. There's MPs there who have promoted tobacco and guns. One who was accused of killing people in Iraq that he refused to confirm or deny. It doesn't seem too meritorious. And, he's got a finance minister with a humanities degree. That definitely sounds woke. There's writer and pianist Paul Goldsmith, and he voted for legalizing same-sex marriage and abortion law reform, so way too woke. Stanford supported same-sex marriage, decriminalizing abortion, and legalized euthanasia, and believes man-made climate change is a thing, so way too woke. Finding the right person to look at woke hiring practices is clearly a very difficult tightrope to walk. Wanting a public service sector where people are there because they are the best people for the job is not a bad thing, and the law change that Winston is rallying against that he supported was designed to make sure the understanding of those roles was wider than before, with a more inclusive outlook on them. But instead of saying that, the Prime Minister falls down the trap laid by Peters and the press and starts going on about wokeism, which is both a nebulous term that means nothing to people with two brain cells and a dog whistle to people whose single brain cell is getting really lonely at this stage, which, based on recent polls, that attitude and that way of approaching things, it's not working out so well for his coalition partners. So what would make him think it would work for him? I guess that's what happens when you hire someone for a job based solely on being at the right place at the right time. Hello there, kia ora. It's easy to forget with the barrage of bad news that we get that there's often some good stuff happening as well. Like how yesterday, police made the first arrests of Destiny Church-linked members of the group which overrun the Te Atatu Community Centre and allegedly assaulted a child and other members of the public in the process. Now, I say the first because the police were really explicit in saying more arrests are on the way. The police arrested 4 people and charged them, a 67-year-old man and 3 women aged 28, 19 and 50 with accounts of assault under the Summary Offences and Crimes Acts, and they're scheduled to appear in court on March 18, with more charges planned because of actions against 5 other victims that are yet to be laid. The next question, though, is will Brian Tamaki end up being swept up in this directly? Tamaki wasn't at the event, and his messaging on this has actually flown in direct contradiction to the messaging from the Church-linked Freedoms and Rights Coalition, whose spokesperson keeps saying that they had no idea that this was coming, but they can't control their members, and they said that about this event as well as events at the Big Gay Out and Wellington's recent Pride event. But Tamaki claims he did know, and that he gave the order for the Te Atatu event and coordinated actions around the country. And that admission is what could get him into legal hot water. Remember that Summary Offences Act that I mentioned that was first used to lay charges? Well, Section 3 of that act is explicit in pointing out that inciting and encouraging people to undertake an act that's offensive, riotous, threatening, and disorderly that will likely end in someone being hurt or property damaged is breaking the law, and that person would be liable for up to 3 months in prison or up to $2,000 in fines. And claiming knowledge, claiming to have given orders, and claiming to have coordinated these linked events, that's as close to a public admission as it's possible to get. But ramifications for his actions may take a bit of time to come to any outcome, if at all. Police are currently looking directly at the event and those impacted, and looking at a wider contributing factor would be a step further down the line. And realistically, the punishment here for Tamaki is next to nothing. Thanks to the tax-free status of all the money he brings in from his followers, a fine that size will mean nothing. And 3 months in prison would actually be perfect martyr fodder for people who, for some reason, buy into his bullshit. And this whole thing may also have an impact on a case where Tamaki is being sued by drag performers from House of Flash. Part of that court action involves threats against the performer's physical safety, and seeing those threats manifest elsewhere with direct links to Tamaki show that the threats needed to be taken very seriously in light of those connections, actions, and outcomes. And letting him or his supporters that have been and will be arrested off scot-free is also a really bad look for a government claiming to be tough on crime. In fact, just this week, Christopher Luxon said the idea of reducing prison numbers was woke, and he's not a fan of woke, so maybe the judiciary should take it on board at any future court date. Peaceful protest is an absolute right we all have, and what happened at Te Atatu was not that. People were hurt, and that violent act created heightened tensions for people within the rainbow community at subsequent events around the motu. It was an intimidation tactic on top of a violent act that has created some issues. And here's where some change could actually be made. Our intimidation laws don't cover the after effects of how an event like what happened in Te Atatu exacerbated the impact on the community it was aimed at, how it created a sense of intimidation for them, which was the whole point of what Tamaki admits he coordinated. But if the government wants to really get tough on crime, then maybe it's time to look at changing that. How about while we wait for more arrests and more charges for thugs who did this in the first place, the government starts doing some work on how the actions of a group to create intimidation over a number of days or events could be something that's really, really dealt with properly. Hello there, kia ora, I'm Paul, and this is this week's The News. Finance Minister Nicola Willis, seen here pointing to the security guards that she's about to screw over, has proposed sweeping changes to procurement rules that government agencies must currently follow, which have been described by the CTU as heartless. These include no longer requiring new builds to have 5-star energy efficiency ratings, no longer purchasing batteries for hybrid and electrical vehicles, no longer purchasing low waste or recyclable office products, and no longer paying the living wage to contractors involved in cleaning, catering, and security guard services. In a note written in oil on a whaleskin parchment that she handed to the press, Willis said, "Nothing says thank you to the people who do this work around Parliament than legally making it possible to pay them less than enough to live on. I mean, we could always raise the minimum wage to the living wage, but got to give those landlords their tax breaks." Winston Peters, seen here pointing at the person who will be most harmed by his sundown ramblings if they became law, has denied his own party constitution includes diversity, equity, and inclusion clauses in its instructions on how list candidates are selected, after his recent yelling at cloud moments about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the public service. In the document, New Zealand First state the need for different genders, social groups, ages, and ethnicities to be represented in their list, which is totally different to the provision for public servants, which is to consider candidates' genders, social groups, ethnicities, and ages. Compass Group, the organisation behind the embattled and slightly melted school lunch fiasco, was this week forced to import school lunches from Australia in the latest embarrassing undertaking in David Seymour's revamped school lunch program. Seymour, seen here avoiding questions about his knowledge of Tim Jargo's sexual assault on minors, this week finally found time in his busy schedule to sit down with Education Minister Erica Stanford to discuss the issues, which have also this week included the first school to officially remove itself from the program over continued substandard offerings, financial failure of 2 subcontractors, including LaBelle Group, a new Talbot Mills poll which indicates 2/3 of New Zealanders want to bring back the old system, and a report that shows that 10% of school lunches haven't shown up on time for school lunch. Said Seymour, "We promised that the new system would still employ New Zealanders, and sure, it may not be ones living in the communities we forced to eat this slop, but with so many having migrated to Australia under this government, I'm sure that there are some Kiwis involved in the process of making the lunches that we imported." Local Government New Zealand has suggested in a new report this week the abolition of postal voting, citing its archaic nature, and instead replace it with voting booths and run election day more in the way of a general election. Said LGNZ Electoral Reform Group member Mayor Reheti Stoltz, engagement in local body elections is at historic lows, and it's dangerous for democracy to have so few people making decisions for the whole. People are clearly disengaged, so much so, most people didn't realise that this isn't actually Mayor Reheti Stoltz. This is. The reheated wealthy investor visa announced last month by the government, which would see wealthy foreigners be able to buy a New Zealand citizenship with a minimum $5 million investment into local business, as long as they also stayed in the country for at least 1 week a year, has seen a massive surge in interest from wealthy Americans, with a 230% increase in inquiries to Immigration New Zealand. Said the Prime Minister, seen here remembering he has a Marmite sandwich waiting for him in the office. "What I'm saying to you is this bodes really well, because American millionaires are historically very good people who make calm, reasoned choices and are never constantly looking at ways to improve the lives of everyone, while they never have plans to influence and undermine democracy and government." Police this week issued $2,250 fines to members of Brian Tamaki's Destiny Church and linked groups for blocking off State Highway 1 to protest against waving the wrong kind of flag. The illegal traffic blockage occurred in Mercer, or as the New Zealand Herald described it, Mercerin, so Tamaki could demand people only wave the New Zealand flag, because free speech. Said Tamaki of the fines, "They're good for it. Do you see how much they give me? I'm sure they have plenty of money to spare." At the government's much-lauded Infrastructure Investment Summit, Chris Bishop this week, seen here trying to use the force, says we are finally ready to put a stake in the ground on a second harbour crossing, and is looking at international investment feedback on the project. He was quick to point out this was different from the 1996 Transit New Zealand suggested plans for a second bridge, the 2006 10-year Transit NZ plan for a tunnel, the 2007 double tunnel plan, the 2008 Waitemata Harbour Crossing Study Group plan, the 2009 Waka Kotahi Wynyard Quarter Plan, the 2007 Anzac Centenary Bridge Plan, the 2010 Stephen Joyce Plan, the 2011 Skypath Plan, and the 2023 Harbour Connections Plan, which were progressed to a point where Chris Luxon said he wanted to go further before he cancelled it when he became Prime Minister in 2023. Wellington Mayor Tory Whānau, seen here hunting for monsters dressed up in man-up shirts with Officer O'Leary from Wellington Paranormal, has responded to comments from Prime Minister Chris Luxon where he called the council lame-o in an insult that would upset the delicate balance of a schoolyard playground filled with 8-year-olds. Mayor Whānau pointed out that the government seems to be targeting Wellington City Council expressly after they didn't make the same comments regarding funding that was not applied for by Christchurch City Council, which led to the Prime Minister's lame-o comment. She noted that Wellington did not vote for him, to which the Prime Minister responded, "I'm not a doo-doo head, I'm going to tell my mummy on you." Winston Peters, seen here outside a place he wants to make sure has less tools for harm reduction, and New Zealand First are celebrating the removal of RSE guidelines from the Ministry of Education website this week. RSE, an expert-produced, peer-reviewed program based on decades of research, has been credited with helping decrease rates of teen pregnancy, STI infections, sexual assault and abuse, and promote a greater understanding of and acceptance of people's identities. Said Peters, "Yes, we did this, and we know it's a shock. It seems like the sort of stuff that the ACT Party presidents would want to have stopped, but we did it first, because our fan base are so indoctrinated that they would rather harm kids than learn what indoctrinated means." And finally this week, Parliament passed a law making it a crime for employers to steal workers' wages. The bill was supported by all opposition parties and New Zealand First, with ACT and National opposing. Labour's Phil Twyford, seen here showing how many votes he won Te Atatu by in 2023, said, "The self-styled party of law and order is voting against a bill that would criminalise the intentional theft of money." While speaking on behalf of National, Katie Nimmin, seen here asking what those long cars are and why anybody would want them, argued that this bill would clog up the justice system, going on to say, "Look, our donors are the ones most impacted by this bill, and there must be a lot of it happening for us to actually believe it will clog up the justice system." Now, before I wrap up, I also want to say a huge thank you to everyone who supports the content that I make. Whether it's liking it or sharing it, or if you're supporting it financially as a YouTube member or a Substack paid subscriber, or helped out with the Buy Me a Coffee page. It all really helps to cover costs for the tools that I use to put it all together. And I know I don't say thank you often enough, so I wanted to make sure I made a point of saying thank you for all of the support in this week's video. Anyway, enough of those awful human emotions. That is this week's The News. Hey, again, thanks for checking out this week's Omnibus. And I want to mirror what I said before in the news about thanking everybody who supports the work that I do. Whether you are watching it, liking it, sharing, subscribing, all of that kind of stuff, it is really appreciated. And for those of you that help out financially with things like a Buy Me a Coffee donation, or joining up as a paid member here on YouTube, or subscribing to my Substack, that helps a lot when it comes to buying things like StreamYard services, which we use for those interviews. Like that one that we had this week with Ruben Davidson from the Labour Party about the future of broadcasting. Next week we've got Malcolm Mulholland, Dr. Malcolm Mulholland, who is the New Zealander of the Year Local Hero winner from last year. Next week we've got, or the week after that, we've got Sam Broughton, the Mayor of Selwyn, and the week after that we've got MP Mark Patterson, the Minister for Rural Communities and the Associate Minister for Agriculture. That's right, we have a government minister coming on for one of our interviews. So it is really appreciated, all that support. It makes it possible to be able to keep paying for these services that we use for that kind of stuff. So again, thank you so much for all of that. Right, I'll leave you to it. Live long, prosper, be one with the Force. I will catch you all next week. Hey, thanks for checking out today's video. Make sure you like, share, subscribe so you get more updates as we go along. We deal with these guys for the rest of the year.